Founded in 1948, Ryerson University is named after Egerton Ryerson, who was born on March 24, 1803. In 1890, a statue of Egerton Ryerson was erected in front of the Education Department building in Toronto. Upon its founding, this building became part of Ryerson University. In his early 20s, Egerton Ryerson lived as a missionary among the Indians of the Credit, and by age 22 he became an ordained minister of the Methodist Church. Egerton Ryerson was a strong advocate for education, including the separation of church and state. In 1841, he became the first president of Victoria College, which today is part of the University of Toronto. 3 years later, Egerton accepted the post of Superintendent of Education for Upper Canada, where he spent the next 32 years of his career building the Ontario public school system. In 1846, Egerton published his creed in a report that outlined his plan for the new school system. 5 years before his retirement in 1871, Egerton's goal of free education was realized when a bill was passed making education compulsory for children under 16. He also established the first teacher training facility. Today, Ontario's public education system credits Egerton Ryerson as its architect. But his most notable contribution toward education is often tragically understated and overlooked. In 1847, just 3 years after Egerton became the Superintendent of Education, the Chief Superintendent of Indian Affairs requested Egerton to prepare a report regarding the education of natives. In his report dated March 18, 1847, Egerton recommended the establishment of industrial schools. Despite his strong advocacy for separating church and state, Egerton felt it was essential to educate natives in the Christian religion. In his report, he wrote,
"It is a fact established by numerous experiments that the North American Indian cannot be civilized or preserved in a state of civilization except in connection with, if not by the influence of, not only religious instruction and sentiment, but of religious feelings. The theory of a certain kind of educational philosophy is falsified in respect to the Indians. With him nothing can be done to improve or elevate his character and condition without the aid of religious feeling. This influence must be superadded to all others to make the Indian a sober and industrious man." Even a knowledge of the doctrines and moral precepts of Orthodox Christianity, with all the appliances of prudential example and instruction, is inadequate to produce in the heart and life of the Indian the spirit and habits of an industrial civilization, without the additional energy and impulsive activity of religious feeling. The religious culture and daily exercises and instruction should be a prominent object of attention, and besides vocal music, generally sacred music, should form an important branch of the education.
Egerton also felt the government should outsource native education to a third party, or what he called a religious agency. This was especially important because religion would be a primary component to their education, and Egerton was an advocate of separating religion from government. Religious organizations such as the United, Anglican, Catholic, and Presbyterian churches were contracted to manage and run the schools. Over 70% of residential schools were contracted to the Roman Catholic Church. Egerton's objective was to assimilate Aboriginal children into the lowest fringes of mainstream society by stripping them of their religious and cultural values. 10 years after his report, the Gradual Civilization Act was passed to assimilate Indians. First Nations children were forcefully removed from their homes and families. More often than not, they were even kidnapped without knowledge of the parents. These children were made prisoners of a religious institution that stripped them of their language, traditions, and culture. Isolated from their mother and father, they were punished by having pins stuck into their tongue if they were caught speaking in their native language. Brothers and sisters were intentionally separated in an effort to sever all family ties. Their hair was cut short to imitate European style, and if they were not being starved as punishment, they were forced to eat food that was either foreign to their upbringing or spoiled. The children endured electrical shock and were forced to eat their own vomit when they became sick. They were exposed to freezing temperatures and were given contaminated blankets that caused disease. The education program involved working the children like slaves instead of educating them in a classroom. They were forced to do manual labor in unsafe conditions, working in fields, laundries, or shops. With no moral conscience and no consequence of being accountable, priests and nuns often raped and sexually abused the children. The schools were places of profound physical and sexual violence, including forced abortions of native children who were impregnated by school staff, as well as beating the child unconscious, burning, and scalding. These horrific and shameful crimes resulted in many children committing suicide, a tragic event that was dismissed by the institutions and went unchecked by government. It is estimated that 60% of the children died while in the residential schools from illness, beatings, failed attempts to escape, or suicide. By the time native children were released from the schools, those who survived the torture barely had a grade 6 education, with very little knowledge of their original culture. Traumatized, many survivors turned to drug and alcohol abuse. As victims of abuse themselves, many survivors became unwitting participants in a cyclical pattern of sexual and family abuse. As a result, today, drug and alcohol abuse among Native people is 5 times the national average. Sexual and family abuse is 8 times the national average, and suicide rates among Native teens is 5 times greater than anywhere else in Canada. The last federal residential school was finally closed as recent as 1990. Egerton Ryerson's recommendations set the stage for 126 of the darkest and most shameful years in Canadian history.